It's 1885, and it's been 20 years since the Civil War ended. Now the nation is at odds with itself all over again. Immigrant group versus immigrant group, capital versus labor, Catholics versus Protestants. This time, the combatants weren't drawn on either side of the Mason-Dixon line. They were drawn across neighborhoods, across factory floors, and even across diocese boundaries. South Bend, Indiana, during its formative years, had not been immune from the ethnic socioeconomic strife that had swept the nation. In 1879, a spat of racism reared its ugly head when the city fined Chang Long for the crime of doing laundry on a Sunday. For years, South Bend had been lax about enforcing the Sabbath, even catching flack among religious prohibitionists for failing to ensure that its saloons were closed on the Lord's Day. A selective and unique enforcement of the statute seemed intended to make a point toward the city's only Chinese citizen. Indeed, the Tribune took Long's side in the controversy, pointing out that the Sabbath law was so little observed that it was practically a dead letter. Of course, the same article also lobbed plenty of offensive and racial epithets toward Mr. Long that I won't repeat here. A few weeks later, a mob fired shots into Chang Long's home and vandalized his laundromat. A few weeks after that, Chang Long left town. The mob had won, and when the newspaper reported on it, they reported Chang Long as the cause of all the commotion in the city instead of the unfortunate man on the receiving end of it. It wasn't the only racial misstep in the city's early history. Mayor Ham had taken heat for assigning extra police to patrol an African American Emancipation Day celebration at the AME Church, and the derisive terms that were used to describe South Bend's early Polish population were rarely kept to whispers, and often made it into print. By 1885, with a population north of 20,000, South Bend had become in so many ways a city divided, Republicans versus Democrats, capital versus labor, and both of those conflicts tinged with racial undertones that kept the city at a steady simmer. By the time the rapidly boiling melting pot finally foamed over, the city had a new mayor, and he just might have been the busiest man the city had ever seen. George Loughman ran the railroad, the building and loan, and the American Life Insurance Company. He was the foreman of the city's #1 firehouse, and in 1884, while doing all of those other things, he also became mayor of South Bend. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Hellman, and during this 8-episode series, we're going to dive into the dawn of the city of South Bend, the first 25 years after its incorporation, through the lens of its first 8 mayors. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this was happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of all 8 episodes in this series by Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend. And now, with all that out of the way, let's jump into the life and times and administration of George Loughman, the man who delivered the mayor's office back to the Republican Party, and maybe the busiest man South Bend had ever seen. George Loughman was born in Brownsville, Ohio on Christmas Day, 1846, the youngest of 3 German-Irish brothers, each eager to make a mark in America. But maybe it was George who was most eager, tagging along with his older brothers to enlist to fight during the Civil War, and sneaking his way into Company G of the 32nd Ohio Infantry, despite not being old enough for service. Loughman saw action during Sherman's March to the Sea and at the Battle of Bentonville, then moved to Mishawaka with his brothers at the war's end. He took a job as a clerk with the Lake Shore and Michigan Southern Railroad in 1865, and worked his way up the ladder until he became freight agent at the South Bend Depot for the railroad, a position he would hold until 1890 and throughout his term as mayor. Loughman made the move from Mishawaka to South Bend 2 years later, and then began the busy season of his life. Besides marrying and having children, Loughman also served as foreman of the city's premier fire crew, Hose Company Number 1, beginning in 1877. It was about that time that his political career began. He was elected to the city council in 1878 and set to the Republican task of cleaning up the city's morality, pushing an ordinance that banned the sale of scurrilous and indecent publications within the city, and pressing for more expensive licenses for saloons and pool halls. Despite the disastrous Republican showing of 1880, Loughman was the only member of his party to win a local election and was reinstated to the council on the wrong end of a 9-1 supermajority. He wouldn't be able to do much against those odds, and he wasn't there very long anyway, resigning his seat when the railroad reassigned him to Chicago in August of that same year. In February 1881, the railroad transferred Loughman back to South Bend, and Republicans were glad to have him back in the city, but Loughman declined the party's nomination to run again for his old seat. He lamented that the time and attention needed to properly serve the city and his employer were at odds with one another, and that he didn't want to have to cheat one to serve the other. The railroad business was booming in South Bend, with 3 companies running lines through the city that handled more than 200,000 tons in freight annually and that brought $450,000 in earnings. That's almost $14 million in today's dollars. Of the 3 railroads, Loughman's Lakeshore and Michigan Southern was the largest, and even though Loughman wasn't the railroad's owner or its most well-paid employee, it meant that he held a position of prominence in the city. He was the face of a railroad that, in earnings, was the 4th largest business in the city, only behind Studebaker, Oliver, and Singer. His notoriety brought him a seat on the board of directors for the new South Bend Building and Loan Association, and when the board voted on positions, he was made president. 1883 came with additional Republican entreaties that tried to convince Loughman to run for office again, but he deflected even more definitively than he did before, running a letter in the papers that he positively refused to be a candidate for councilman. His Republican friends might have been sullen at the announcement, but it was hard to argue with the man's reasoning. His day job as railroad agent meant he was on call 24/7. He could be interrupted anywhere, at any time, whenever there was a derailment, a delay, or a drunken traveler with the misfortune to stumble beneath a moving train. Each of those things happened more often than you would expect. Besides the railroad work, there was his side gig selling shares in the building and loan, and besides all of that, he was a dedicated and committed fireman. It was this last one that might have been Loughman's greatest passion. By the time he died, the newspapers would lament him as a businessman, a banker, and an ex-mayor. But if Loughman could have written his own obituary, he probably would have chosen to lead with firefighter. So with everything else going on, Loughman's political career was stalled, and it was going to take a real provocation to get him to put his hat back into the ring. But on June 16, 1883, the Democratic-led city council was going to give it to him. Still reeling from the financial impropriety of Clint Rush, Dr. Levi Ham and the city council were left to make budget cuts in order to balance the city budget against its fraudulent shortfall. Remember, by the time Rush's bondsman paid up, there was still $3,500 missing. That $3,500 had to come from somewhere. It could have come from anywhere. But they chose the firemen. The city council cut funding for the fire station's gear, supplies, and eliminated the modest stipends it allotted its men. It was never going to be a popular move with the city's Republicans, but it was a move that came with a silver lining. It lit a fire beneath George Loughman and made him a fixture and a thorn at local council meetings. The next year, the Republicans wouldn't invite Loughman to be their councilman. They'd ask him to be their mayor. The circumstances of Loughman's life hadn't changed. He still had the railroad and the building and loan. He made it clear that he would not quit fighting fires under any circumstance. He also stepped into the presidency of the local office of the American Life Insurance Company and competed in a spelling bee that he lost when he fumbled on the word Satan. He could have made the case that he had 4 jobs already, but he didn't. When the Republicans nominated him by acclaim and without opposition, Loughman accepted the nod. On May 6, 1884, as construction began on the Oliver Opera House, and as local dredging efforts began in earnest at the Kankakee Marsh, the Republicans had a candidate strong enough to challenge the dominant Democratic Party. It was going to be a contentious race, and the result would be the closest mayoral election South Bend had ever seen. We'll catch up with the returns right after the break. South Bend Toy Company is excited to introduce the $1 wagon, for sale right now at the Tribune store at the northeast corner of Washington and Main Streets. This handsome homemade wagon features a 13 by 26 inch box, varnished and ornamented in red, has iron axles, iron and hub, 10-inch front wheels, and 14-inch rear wheels. The dollar wagon is very stout, and it's just what your boy or girl wants. And did we mention it's just $1? And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum. The Democrats were quick to claim victory in South Bend's 1884 elections, lighting a bonfire on downtown streets and dancing a ruckus around the thing in celebration of another great win, the third in 6 years for a Democratic Party that had been a non-factor a decade prior. There was just one problem with the party, and the blaze that came with it. The Democrats hadn't won just yet, and if there was anyone in the city who could extinguish their hopes in ways literal and figurative, it was George Loughman. The final returns showed a narrow Republican victory, but a Republican victory all the same. Loughman had beat out Democrat Timothy Howard by fewer than 100 votes. Sullen Democrats abandoned their bonfire, and cheerful Republicans picked up the celebration where their adversaries had left off. Now, don't feel too bad for Howard. In the aftermath of losing the mayor's race, Howard vaulted to a position in the state senate, accepted a gig as South Bend city attorney, and was appointed to the Indiana Supreme Court. Howard Park is named after him, and Howard's most enduring legacy is that his History of St. Joseph County is the most important local history book that we have. Loughman wasn't the only Republican winner on that election night, as his party had also seized the offices of treasurer, clerk, marshal, and waterworks trustee, as well as a pair of council seats. The Tribune called this new bunch a daisy crowd and wished for them to live long and prosper, 80 years before America even knew who Spock was. As for Loughman, there probably should have been some question about how he was going to balance his professional life with his political one, but the assumption was that he intended to return South Bend city government to the kind of quiet, occasional, part-time body that it had been for the first decade of its existence, before the Democrats took over. And for his first year in office, that's exactly what he did, legislating very little and serving a ceremonial role more than anything else. He issued proclamations shutting down city operations on Memorial Day and on the 4th of July. He led a remote and public commemoration when the cornerstone for the Statue of Liberty was laid down. He was on hand to help open the Oliver Opera House. Once located just north of the JMS building, the Opera House was a grand $200,000 building featuring a marble and mahogany vestibule, frescoes, curtains, and sceneries painted by Chicago artists. Loughman was there for the venue's first performance, a production of Louis XI, with the lead role played by W.E. Sheridan. 1884 had been a busy year for Loughman, even if it hadn't been a particularly busy year for the city council, and that's exactly the way the Republicans would have wanted it. The most exciting moment of that first year came in October, when Republican presidential candidate James Blaine made a 2-day trip to South Bend. Blaine had been given a strange nickname several years prior and was known across the nation as the Plumed Knight. South Bend was keen on the sobriquet and organized an escort of plumed knights to greet him upon his arrival. Dozens of prominent South Benders dressed in black suits, white belts, and plumed helmets formed a gauntlet between the train depot and Blaine's carriage. Blaine's train rolled into the city amidst the celebratory booms of cannons, the waving of flags, and the cheers of as many as 40,000 people from all over the region. Besides the plumed knights, there were also 36 young women dressed in fairy whites, one for each state. A carriage procession featuring Blaine and his entourage, South Bend's Republican leadership, and its business elite lasted for 90 minutes before the speeches even began. The Tribune's praise was enthusiastic, to put it mildly, saying of Blaine that a nobler specimen of manhood it would be difficult to find, standing erect in the full prime of a glorious life, his full beard, mustache, and hair silvered with the frosts that touch us all when the half-century of life is reached. After the speeches, Blaine retired to the Studebaker home for an extravagant dinner ahead of a second parade. This one, a 7 p.m. torch-lit procession that featured no fewer than 15 cornet bands and 4,500 torch-bearers, a number that must have kept George Loughman and his fireman buddies on high alert. Fortunately, the night was without incident, and the only bells that were rung came in celebration and adulation. Blaine spent the night with the Studebakers, joined them at Milburn Chapel for church the next morning, then made scheduled visits to Notre Dame and St. Mary's. Before leaving town, Blaine remarked that he had not anywhere been met with such an enthusiastic welcome as this. In November, Blaine lost the presidential election to Grover Cleveland, and in the process failed to carry Indiana. In the days after the presidential election, Loughman re-enlisted with Hose Company No. 1, telling the crew that if he didn't get out to a fire with the boys, he expected them to fine him. As for the actual work of a mayor and his council, the city approved sidewalk improvements, ordered a few gutters cleaned, and rubber-stamped building permits for new construction projects within the city's limits. In the mayor's court, Loughman tried gamblers, prostitutes, and at least 2 cases that involved loose cows being run through the city limits. He suspended a police officer for drinking on the job. It was a quiet year in city politics, and in many ways a boring one, but that was okay. After the financial scandals of years previous, no news was probably good news. Unfortunately, it wasn't going to stay that way. The next year was going to bring an unimaginable political firestorm, and Mayor Loughman was going to need more than a length of hose to put it out. Find out why the Coquillard wagon is the farmer's favorite. Made by the best wood and iron that can be procured and put together by the most experienced workmen in the Midwest, every Coquillard wagon is warranted to your satisfaction in quality and workmanship and made right here in South Bend. Coquillard wagons are noted for the lightness of draft and ease of running. Carriages, buggies, and sleighs are always available. Get your Coquillard wagon wherever fine vehicles are sold. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum. The violence had already begun in earnest by the time Captain Nicker arrived at the Oliver Chilled Plow Works on January 12th and pushed through the chanting, riotous fray of angry humanity. It all started as a strike, controversy enough in 1885, but it devolved quickly from there. The labor dispute had been bubbling for months, a slow boil followed by a sudden explosion. The strike began when a group of Polish workers set down their tools and walked out of the factory, a peaceful enough way to solicit change. But the peace gave way to chaos when other factory workers remained at their posts, uninterested in or unaware of the planned demonstrations for the day. In particular, an entire group of Swedish workers kept toiling away, at least as long as the strikers would let them. Armed with wrenches and hammers, the strikers hurled epithets at the so-called scabs who'd stayed behind, then threatened them with beatings if they did not join the cause. When the Swedes put their heads down to get back to work, the strikers proved that the beatings were not empty threats. In minutes, the place was a fracas, and when the police arrived, it only nudged the heat higher. The police were beaten, punched, and kicked. They had objects hurled at them. By the time any sense of order was restored, one of the officers was being hauled off toward a doctor along with a dozen workers who'd gotten caught up in the fray. It was a miracle no one was killed, although according to the courts it wasn't for lack of trying. Besides assault and disturbing the peace, a few of the strikers were imprisoned and charged with attempted murder. That was just the beginning of the fallout, the first domino in a long line that would very nearly derail the young city. This story was going to eat dozens of yards of column inches in every newspaper in South Bend for months, and there was really only one conceivable thing that could happen in order to keep the Oliver riot off of the front page. And then, that's exactly the thing that happened. Schuyler Colfax died. It came out of nowhere, and it left South Bend in a gasping, breathless shock, maybe even providing enough of a gut punch to forestall the onset of more violence at the Oliver factory. Colfax was just 61 years old when he died on a train platform in Minnesota, and South Benders recalled seeing him healthy and in good spirits just a few days before he made the trip up north. Colfax had been South Bend's greatest political figure and a shining star who helped vault the city onto a national stage. Besides all of that, he was someone who'd been ever present in South Bend during his later years, turning up as an investor in various business ventures, petitioning the city council, and worshiping at local churches. And now, he was gone. The Tribune captured the feeling that swept over the city like this. No pen can depict the weight of anguish that rests upon the hearts of those who so dearly loved him and shared with him the sweet sanctities of his home, the pure life, the gentleness, the kindness, and the manliness that pervaded all his actions and made his home a charming one for its inmates and for all that shared its hospitalities. It is, of all things, the saddest that those bound to him by the tenderest ties of the home circle are called to yield him to the grave. The funeral rites for Schuyler Colfax would envelop the city for days. His obituaries filled entire issues of the newspaper. On January 17th, Mayor Loughman issued an executive decree that ordered the closing of all places of business from 1 to 4 p.m. in honor of the statesman's life. That decree didn't upset the work of the Oliver factory anyway. They hadn't opened up since the strike, and by the time the next month passed, they still hadn't resumed production. The talk in the city, and around the country, was that they would never open again. The Olivers were making plans to take their business elsewhere. They were going to leave South Bend. Father Soren sent James Oliver a personal letter asking them not to leave. The Olivers demurred. It seemed to be a done deal. It felt like it wasn't a question of if they would go, but where. On February 17, 1885, the day after Charles Dow published the first Dow Jones Industrial Average, Mayor George Loughman launched a plan to persuade the Olivers to stay. He called a citizens' meeting at the courthouse where they drew up resolutions and wrote down lists of entreaties begging James and J.D. Oliver to reconsider their relocation. Their eyes circled the room as they wondered whose voice would hold the most sway with the Olivers when it came time to make a speech, and then they mourned all over again when they remembered that voice was gone and had been buried a month ago. In the end, it was ex-Mayor Lucius Tong who gave the speech. A long line of citizens marched 2 by 2 from the courthouse to the Oliver residence. Tong spoke. The Olivers listened. A visibly moved James Oliver spoke through welled tears, thanking his friends for coming, and told them how much he appreciated their support. Then he admitted the sad truth. He and J.D. saw no way forward in South Bend, and they were actively pursuing other opportunities in other cities. Within the next week, 70 cities would make their pitch to acquire the Oliver business. Papers across the Midwest were reporting that the Olivers had been surveying Indianapolis, and that a move to Indiana's capital was all but a done deal. In 1885, Studebaker was the biggest game in town, but Oliver was number 2. Losing Oliver would have kneecapped South Bend's economy in the short run, and the ding on the city's reputation might have proved fatal in the long run. Loughman couldn't let that happen, and so he did the only thing he could. He called another citizens' meeting and presented another set of entreaties toward the Oliver family. It appears that this second attempt persuaded the Olivers to stay. Either that, or the city council's decision to prosecute all of the so-called troublemakers who'd started the strike, and to appoint 100 extra special police officers to protect the city's industries and factories. And yes, that's a lot of police officers. On March 3rd of 1885, AT&T was incorporated. On March 4th, Grover Cleveland was inaugurated. And on March 5th, the Oliver Chilled Plow Works reopened for production. One of those events was much bigger news in South Bend than the others, a cataclysm avoided, and a feather in Loughman's cap that would serve him well during his re-election campaign. And there were other good things happening in South Bend in 1885. By May, after several stops and starts, the first tests began on the city streetcar system while crowds of hundreds looked on. It was about to be the first electric streetcar system in the United States. The newspaper was excited about the opening of the streetcar, and they marked their excitement with some reporting that, frankly, feels a little over the top. There is going to be some competition for the glory of being the first man to ride on our new streetcars. The name of the lucky man will go down to posterity, enshrined in the hearts of the people, and when he dies, it will be said of him that he was the first man to ride on the new street railway of South Bend. In a few years, when the city assumes metropolitan proportions, such a man will be a great curiosity, and the public will regard him as public property, and the city council of that day will appropriate enough to keep him in his old age. His picture will be framed and hung up in the elegant new council chamber alongside that of the first mayor and the first postmaster and the first street commissioner. When the elevated railway runs past our second-story windows and the town of Mishawaka has been converted into the South Bend Park, it will be pleasant to sit in that park and contemplate the marble bust of the man who was the first passenger on the streetcar of South Bend. There's a lot happening there, not the least of which is the assumption that South Bend will take over Mishawaka and turn it into a park, which explains a lot about the relationship between those two cities. Anyway, on May 29, 1885, the street railway opened to the public and did a booming business through the weekend and into the summer. The name of the first rider was not recorded. So there was some good news in a city that had started its year with plenty of bad news, but there was still more bad news too. Despite the end of the Oliver strike and the convictions and sentencings of the most violent of the strikers, tensions in the city hadn't exactly cooled. The aftermath of the whole ordeal left a rift between the Polish and Swedish communities, and summer brought out brawls, vandals, and unprovoked attacks. The worst of these were preempted in the news cycle by the death of the president that Schuyler Colfax had served under, General Ulysses S. Grant. And as if that wasn't enough for 1 year, the parent company of the life insurance business that George Loughman was still running collapsed underneath the fraud of Loughman's higher-ups, necessitating court appearances and mediation sessions that filled his December. In the end, Loughman was completely exonerated of any wrongdoing, but he was certainly glad to see his year end. 1886 would bring another campaign, and Loughman was willing again to run for office. But before that could happen, there was the matter of a month-long strike at the Studebaker factory. At least this one was peaceful, and the Studebakers did not threaten to take their business elsewhere. By this point, they were stuck in South Bend whether they liked it or not. A month before the strike began, the enormous stones had begun to arrive in South Bend for construction on Clem Studebaker's Tippecanoe Place. More than a century later, after having been a school, a Red Cross hospital, and a restaurant, Tippecanoe Place is still there. Loughman won the 1886 election with a significant majority and began his second term on May 11th, 3 days after the invention of Coca-Cola. During his inaugural speech, he called for upgrades to the city's water system, specifically the need to replace all of the wooden pipes with iron ones. He also pushed to create a full-time professional and nonpartisan fire department and police force. Before his tenure was over, all three of those ambitious endeavors would be made complete. By the end of 1886, just 21 years after its incorporation, South Bend had a decidedly cosmopolitan feel. Streetcars, running water, sewers, electric lights, telephones and fire alarms, professional firefighters and policemen, new buildings, impressive construction, even an apocalyptic September storm that brought hail the size of hen's eggs couldn't dull the sense of optimism that forward-thinking South Benders had about their home. In October, Loughman wooed the Wilson Shirt brothers to construct a new factory at the corner of Sample and Prairie, and in December, the city oohed and awed as a 7,000-pound stone was brought in for the Studebaker residence. It had been tenuous for a while there, but the city was healthy, modern, well-equipped, and content, at least until the next shiny thing came around. The next shiny thing came around in spring 1887. Newspapers had run articles about property owners who became millionaires in an instant when natural gas was found in the ground beneath their properties, and you couldn't blame South Benders for wanting to get in on that too. The Olivers were the first to get an oil derrick onto their land, and South Bend watched with bated breath as the newspapers reported daily how many more feet the drills had probed than they had the day before. Loughman got in on the game too, forming a stock company, selling shares to start a citizens' gas company, and installing an oil derrick in June at what is now the corner of Lincoln Way and Cushing Street. Both derricks would fail, both efforts would go bankrupt, and neither would strike it rich. Loughman's second term was quieter than the first one, the failure of the gas companies notwithstanding, and it was probably a much-needed break for a man who'd spent his entire tenure working several other jobs at the same time. It raised plenty of questions for a city council that had hired professional police officers and firemen, but still treated the mayorship like a part-time job. If there was any progress to be made on that issue, it wouldn't come before the end of Loughman's time in office. He stepped away after 2 terms, and the papers reported that he left behind a legacy that included support for the growth of the police and fire departments, as well as moral crusades and crackdowns against gambling, prostitution, and unlicensed saloonery. They failed to mention that he'd done more than anyone outside of the Oliver family to make sure the Chilled Plow Works remained in South Bend. Unable to stay still for too long, Loughman became general manager of the Fabric Roll Protector Company in South Bend 2 years after he left the mayor's office. He served 2 terms as county auditor and helped launch South Bend's Humane Society. George Loughman died on February 28, 1909. He is buried in the city cemetery. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Hellman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks to Andy and Tina Nickel for underwriting this episode and all 8 episodes in the series. Our final episode in this series will pick up where this one left off, with South Bend's 8th mayor, William Longley, and I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.